So we're going to be working on Zoom partners, and this is the first in a series of similar exercises. So we're going to take a little bit more time on this one, and we'll go a little faster on the next two, hopefully as you get a little bit more experience. These exercises can be found in your D2L folder, your Brightspace folder, and I welcome you to download them and print them off and try them first before walking through them here. This exercise asked for operating income under absorption and variable. I'm also going to do throughput just to illustrate that for you as well. So just a brief reminder that under absorption costing, the fixed overhead for the period gets assigned to the units made during that period. And so the unsold units which are left on the balance sheet have fixed overhead attached to them. In variable costing, the fixed overhead, factory overhead, manufacturing overhead, is considered a period cost. It's considered the cost of capacity for that month, and it has no further value after the month is over, and so it's not attached to the inventory as if that was a cost that could benefit a future period, and it's all expense during the period. That's not allowed under GAAP, but it is often a management choice. Throughput only inventories material, and labor and the factory overhead is a capacity charge, and the rest, so that's all expense during the period, and only material per unit is inventory. Now here I have kept the format identical for the three methods. These are all contribution margin income statements. We could convert them to a gross margin income statement, a traditional one, if we wanted to. The data wouldn't change. But by keeping the format consistent here, I think it's a little easier to see how they're the same and how they are different. And of course, with the absorption, which is typically the one where the traditional format is used, you can easily take the cost of goods sold, fixed and variable, and group them together and get a traditional total cost of goods sold and then a gross margin subtotal, and then put all the non-product costs, the operating costs, below the gross margin subtotal. All right, so the sales for each of the three methods would be the same. It's the selling price per unit times the units sold. So there's never any difference in terms of the selling piece of it. The only thing that's different is how you handle labor and overhead. Now the variable cost of goods sold is the same for all three methods. So what is the variable cost of goods sold? So that is the material per unit and the labor per unit and the variable manufacturing overhead per unit. Notice I'm not including the variable operating cost because that's not a product cost. It might be variable, but it's not a product cost. So it's not going to go into the cost of goods sold. And then this is times the units sold. And the variable cost of goods sold is identical in the absorption and variable costing method. It's not identical in the throughput because in the throughput we only include the cost of material in the unit cost. So for that method it's a little bit different. What about the variable operating? It is the same for each method. There is no difference. That's not one of the features under which there's a difference. You have to know how to calculate it, but it's the same under all three methods. So how you handle the factory overhead, how you handle direct labor is different. But everything else is the same. Sales is the same. Selling, general, administrative, which is what operating costs are the same. Now the fixed cost of goods sold, that's where you're going to get into some really different stuff. So for absorption costing, we need the fixed overhead rate for the period. So there's your formula. Now the budgeted fixed manufacturing they give you, and then I think they should have told us how they were applying overhead, whether they were doing it based on machine hours or based on units. But let's spread it based on units. I don't think they tell you that, but they should. Let's add that. Okay. So in the prior chapter, you studied the volume variance. Here they tell you that there are no price, efficiency, or spending variance, and any volume variance is written off to cost of goods sold. And do we have a volume variance here? Was the production different than the estimated 200,000 production in the budget? If so, we'll have a volume variance. Well, they tell us what they've sold, and they tell you beginning and ending inventory, but they don't actually tell you production. So you can tell from here that finished goods inventory went up by 5,000 units. And the only way to increase it is to produce more than you sold. So we must have produced 205,000. And so that 5,000 additional units more than what we budgeted will give you a volume variance times this $3. So we do have a volume variance. And since we produced more than the budget, that's unfavorable, meaning that we applied too much in the work in process, and so it's going to be a minus. We're going to reduce cost of goods sold by that. But notice, since we're not grouping the parts that belong to cost of goods sold together in a traditional format income statement, they're kind of all in these different spots. But if you were doing a traditional sales minus cost of goods sold equal gross profit, the variable cost of goods sold, the fixed cost of goods sold, and the volume variance would all be netted together as the adjusted cost of goods sold. Okay, and then the fixed operating will be the same under all the methods. So we can slot those in right now. There's no difference in the fixed, selling, general, and administrative under these three methods. Okay, so now we can do the finish, the absorption. So sales minus the variable cost gives us contribution margin, and then contribution margin minus these costs except plus the volume variance gives us the operating income for the year. Now let's go down here and finish the variable income statement. Variable method income statement. So the contribution margin is the same computation, but now what goes into fixed cost of goods sold? What goes into fixed cost of goods sold is the whole thing, regardless of how many units you made. You're not applying it to the units. You're not using this $3 per unit and applying that into work in process, because it's not going into work in process. It is going straight to the income statement as a period cost. And since it's going straight to the income statement as a period cost, it doesn't get attached to any per unit. So there's never any volume variance in variable method. And one of the things that I like to do to verify that my profits are looking reasonable is to see if the difference between absorption and variable is the number of units added or subtracted from inventory times the fixed overhead per unit. So we added 5,000 units to inventory during the period at $3 a unit. So there should be a $15,000 difference between them, and there is. So then I know that everything's working the way I intended it to work. All right, so now fixed cost of goods sold here under throughput is going to be considered the labor and the overhead, variable and fixed manufacturing overhead. So what's going in here is going to be the labor and the variable overhead times the units produced, because whether they're produced or sold doesn't matter on throughput. Whatever you incurred in making the things, whether they were sold or not, is going to get expensed. and then also the fixed manufacturing. So let's just review that one more time. What gets expensed in throughput as a period cost is the labor you used in making the thing. And so that includes the labor for all the units produced, not what's sold, what was produced, because it's all going to get debited to a period cost. It's not going into work in process. Only materials are going into work in process. And you won't have any volume variance under throughput because there's not going to be anything applied to work in process that's different from what you've incurred. Alrighty. So that was your first one. And so now you'll have a second one that you can work on. You can print it off and you can work the calculations and then walk through it with me. By the third one, you should be able to set up your own income statements. And so I won't be providing them for you in the handout. I want you to learn to move to having just white space and not having a grid set up for you, having you produce your own grid.